Not too long. Terry thought, Mark said it'd take a long time to quiet you down, but I see that it didn't. So welcome to this first Schemel Forum World Affairs Luncheon Seminar of the fall semester. We're delighted to see all of you. I see we've had to set up more tables, and we're very pleased about that. Remember the rest of the series. I hope to see all of you very soon again, 5 more times at least. It's always a pleasure to welcome Jill Dougherty back to the Schemel Forum. As one of the world's leading international journalists and as a native daughter, but her appearance here today is much more. It is the most auspicious beginning I can imagine to our World Affairs Luncheon series. Not only because Jill has had a passion for Russia since her days at Scranton Central High School, and not only because she was the head of CNN's Moscow desk for several years, in fact, when we first met, and not only because she is completing a master's degree program on Putin's Russia at Georgetown University, but most relevant because Jill returned from Moscow only 2 days ago, where she was on assignment with the State Department. How privileged we are to have a first-hand account of a situation that may have just set our nation and our world on a new course in foreign affairs. This might be the most interesting moment in foreign affairs in years on several fronts, but surely with regard to Putin's soft power that Jill has been studying throughout the past year. Putin stepping up to the plate at this moment, changing the discussion from warheads to talking heads, is a critically significant turn of events in these war-weary times. Putin has never been regarded as a proponent of peace or democracy or as a friend of the West. He has been provocative and hostile in his attitude toward freedom of the press, toward gay marriage, and other institutions that represent modernity and open-mindedness. His recent op-ed piece in the New York Times was at once a window into a diplomatic solution in Syria, and at the same time, an opportunity to take a rather paternalistic crack at the U.S. Still, he just may be the game changer we were looking for. Jill Dougherty is here to give us a glimpse at what is going on right now, and what is arguably the most interesting and significant moment in recent history. I don't want to waste another moment of my time by so I asked Jill to come up, and please welcome her.
I feel kind of, cut off from you. I wish I were kind of over here or over here to be able to talk, but I want to make this as informal as possible, and certainly have a lot of questions. And, Sandra, I have to really thank you so much for inviting me again to do it. I figured after the last one you might have second thoughts, but you said to come back, and I'm really glad that I'm here. And as I said to Sandra, I literally got off the plane Tuesday night from Moscow, and I felt like ripping up the speech and kind of starting over, because in a way, obviously I will get into soft power, but I wanted to kind of delve into the mind of Vladimir Putin and delve into what is going on in Russia on many levels, because it's not that easy just to look at it in black and white terms. It's a very complex situation, it's a complex society, and Putin is a very complex man. I mean, he is, as Sandra rightly said, he has been critical of the United States, he has challenged the United States, but on the other hand, he's been a friend to the United States. I mean, if you remember, after 9/11, the attack on 9/11, Putin was the first international leader who called George Bush to express his condolences and his solidarity. And right after that call, Russia made it possible for the United States to have overflight into Afghanistan during the operation that the United States had after that attack. And on many levels, he's played it both ways. And I think as I, and maybe as you go through this, trying to understand Putin, there's a duality in Putin, which is, as many leaders, but I think especially in Russia, there is the domestic game, and then there's the international game. And you always have to remember, as many American politicians play a domestic game, say things that their constituents want to hear, Putin does the same thing. It's not a monolithic country. And so he is playing on many levels domestically to the audience. And the audience might be, let's say, their military-industrial complex, or it might be very conservative, older voters in small towns across Russia, uneducated for the most part, and probably not economically very well off, whom he wants to keep on his side. And that's why you hear a lot of the very conservative rhetoric that comes out from him. But I want to start with something that Sandra is mentioning, this moment in history between Russia and the United States. I don't think anybody can overplay it or underplay it, but something is changing. Whether it will turn into something, we don't know, but I think it's an important moment that we should look at, and it has to do with Syria. You've been watching what's going on, but just to refresh our memories, a few weeks ago, John Kerry, Secretary of State, the man that I cover at the State Department, made what looked like an offhand comment. He said, a reporter asked him, what can we do about Assad? And he said, well, if he really wanted to change the equation, what he could do is give up his chemical weapons. And then he added, but of course he's not going to do that. Now, whether that was offhand, whether it's been discussed for a while, and it was, that idea of chemical weapons and the danger of chemical weapons had been discussed for quite a long time. In fact, since the beginning of the conflict about 2 years ago, because Russia and the United States knew that it was highly dangerous. President Assad has a very large collection, let's say, or arsenal of chemical weapons. Both countries were legitimately worried about what would happen to that. And in the beginning, they talked about methods of dealing with it, but it didn't gel. And then at this moment, it seems to have gelled, and very quickly. I mean, when you look at diplomacy that usually cranks on for months and years, within the past few weeks, the United States and Russia have been able to come together on what started as the foreign minister of Russia, Lavrov, Sergei Lavrov, picking up John Kerry's idea and saying, maybe we can work out a way of disarming Syria's chemical weapons. And I would have to almost check my iPhone to see what the latest information is. It's happening very quickly. But at the United Nations, they have come to an agreement on some type of a resolution, a UN Security Council resolution, that would would require Syria to give up its chemical weapons. And the latest is maybe not even destroy the weapons, but render them unusable, might be the phrase you're going to see, render them unusable. And then, lo and behold, there could be some type of enforcement mechanisms. Now, one of the reasons enforcement mechanisms are so important is that Russia, up until this point, had very strongly objected to President Obama's idea that you needed to use military force to disarm Assad. Now, what they're saying is, yes, it could go back to the United Nations Security Council if Syria doesn't give up these weapons, and they will do something. Now, what will they do? They'll take a vote and decide on what kind of punishment there might be. But it's a step forward that Russia is even open to the possibility of taking some type of sanctions, and maybe even all the way up to some type of military force, ultimately, against Syria. We don't know. And certainly, at least rhetorically, they've been very much opposed to that, taking any type of military action. But this is happening, right under our noses, right as we are sitting here. This diplomacy is going on. And I have to ask myself, how did that happen? Why is it happening so quickly? There was a theory, almost at the beginning of this conflict, that Russia would play its game on Syria because it has interests, certainly, arms sale. Tens of thousands of Syrians and are married to Russians. A lot of people don't know this, but there actually are tens of thousands of Russians in Syria, a lot of them women who are married to Syrians. It happened during the Cold War. They moved there, and that is a factor. The Russian Orthodox Church is a factor in Syria for Russians. When they look at it, they think the Syrians who are Christian in Syria tend to be Orthodox Christians. And of course, Russians are, most of them are Orthodox Christians as well. And there's very much a concern about the Christian community in Syria. So there are a lot of different aspects to this that Russians look at that we might not necessarily pick up on. But this theory was, as time went on and Assad's cards began to fold, that Russia eventually, at the last minute, would turn and maybe go against Assad when they knew that the game was over. And I don't know whether we're seeing that. Is the game over? We don't really know whether the opposition can change the equation so much that Assad might step down. But in any case, the Russians at this point have decided that they're willing, to disarm him from chemical weapons. So it is, I think, it's an important moment in the relationship. Now, as I said, I wanted to talk about Vladimir Putin and the mind of Vladimir Putin. By the way, I have to apologize. When I was in Moscow, I run, and I was on the streets of Moscow running. Every time I go there, I get some type of sinus infection and kind of crazy throat. So I'll use my water liberally to see if I can not cough my way through. But, the mind of Vladimir Putin. Well, there are people who probably know this a lot better than I do, but they're not talking. The people who really know Putin and whether, who is he, what motivates him. In fact, I'll give you an example. When I was there was a story that came out, this is just a few days ago. There was a story that Putin had gotten married. And as you recall, he just recently got divorced from his wife. They agreed that after many years of marriage, they were going to separate. You probably don't even know what Mrs. Putin looks like because she was very much behind the scenes. And they have 2 daughters. Nobody knows much about the daughters either. So a lot of kind of, behind the scenes stuff. There was also a very heavy rumor, which has been going on for at least 5 years, that Mr. Putin was in a relationship with a young gymnast. Her last name is Kabayeva, and she is, if just Google Kabayeva, and you will see her. She's 30 years old. Vladimir Putin is roughly my age. She's 61, I think, and so kind of a younger woman. And in very good shape because she's a gymnast. She's also very attractive. And the story was that they were an item. And even in the Russian media, although it was not encouraged, there were stories that they had at least 1, if not 2 children. And, it went on, but nobody could prove this. And the Kremlin has consistently denied all of this. So literally last week, when I'm in Moscow, CNN says, what about this story that he just got married to Ms. Kabayeva? And I said, you know, what? I don't think it actually happened. And again, the Kremlin denied it. But it was so detailed that they said they got married in a monastery where I was at a conference, had just been in that very same monastery in Valdai, Russia. Beautiful place. And I saw no signs, by the way, that Vladimir Putin was getting married. I did not see Ms. Kabayeva there either. But the place was shut down. And so the rumor mill shut down because of our conference. And the rumor mill got out that Vladimir Putin had flown in or helicoptered in and had gotten married. Now, if he has, I will report to you immediately that this has actually happened. But the story gets stranger because I get back to Washington, and the very next day, when I get off the flight, I meet with a person who is from a think tank in Washington. And I related this story and was saying, oh my goodness, you know, spare me. It sounds like, you know, the Midnight Sun newspaper or something. And she said, well, actually, it may not be totally far-fetched. And then she goes on to tell me that some international security services from a country that's very close to the United States, I won't tell exactly which one, but you can probably imagine, had confirmed that indeed there probably was a relationship between President Putin and this woman. So it's very opaque, let's put it that way. The country is very opaque. We will probably never know. One of my friends who's pretty plugged into the Kremlin side of it, she is Russian, said she doubted that Putin would ever publicly get married again because it would cut against the image of him as a man who's married to his job and married to Russia. You know, in fact, that he had given up his life for his country. And he had, in fact, worked himself so, you know, to the bone that it essentially destroyed his marriage of many, many years. And that was the story, the narrative that they wanted to, that the Kremlin wanted. So I think that might be right, that maybe we'll never see Vladimir Putin get married again. It doesn't mean that he can't have relationships, but there's, you know, in Russia, even though it's maybe not quite like the United States, your public image is important. And again, I get back to that domestic image, Mr. Putin, savior of Russia, man who has stood up for Russia's interests, and then that international image. So just let's go through a very quick history lesson. You know, where did he come from and how did he get to where he is? Because it's very unlikely that he would get to where he is when you think of it. He grew up in Leningrad, and I studied, in fact, thanks to, I don't know whether Michael Peregrine, my former teacher, is in the group today, but I studied Russian in high school here at Scranton Central High School, which no longer exists, and then luckily was able to get a fellowship to go to Leningrad to study. And it turns out that Vladimir Putin was at Leningrad State University at the same time I was, except that he was, of course, not, you know, an exchange student, but he was there. And so he you know, grew up in Leningrad, kind of war-torn, still war-torn Leningrad. Even in the 60s and 70s, it felt like World War II was just over. It had suffered greatly during the war, and Putin lived in a cold water flat with his family. They bathed, basically they had no running hot water. It was a pretty, you know, simple and poverty-stricken, well, maybe not poverty-stricken because everybody was kind of that way, but a very limited, economically limited background. Then he wants to become a KGB agent. I'll just go through this quickly, but I think it's a good reminder of how he got to where he is. Wanted to become a KGB agent, went to Dresden in Germany, served there for quite a while, missed the end of the Soviet Union. And sometimes we don't think of this, but in '91, when the Soviet Union ended, Vladimir Putin was in Germany, not in Russia. And there was a lot of ferment. I was there at the time. I remember that period very well. There was so much ferment in the air, and so many people who felt that they could start over and begin, a new country. There was danger that the entire Soviet Union could implode and become a failed state, that the nukes would be, loose nukes, that people could blow up. It would turn into a civil war. And so it was a dangerous and frightening time, but it was also an exhilarating time because people felt that they could take power into their hands, that they could change society and do it over, forget about communism. But Putin, as he was in Germany, missed that. And I think it's important because he was in a very closed East German existence there. I mean, he's a very smart man, very analytical, very quick study on almost everything. But he missed that ferment. But he came back at the end of the Soviet Union, comes back, starts working in the local government in St. Petersburg, Leningrad, and then turns into St. Petersburg, renamed, starts in the government, and then very quickly moves forward. He was actually in the government of a reformer, his name was Sobchak, in St. Petersburg. So on the side of reform from the early days of the Soviet Union, of Russia post-Soviet, he goes to Moscow, begins working with Yeltsin, and begins a very, very quick climb up the ladder into a position of responsibility. Fast forward to December 31st, 1999, when Boris Yeltsin, we're all thinking about Y2K, remember Y2K, which didn't happen. Boris Yeltsin comes on TV and says, I have a person who is going to succeed me as what I hope, the head of Russia. And it was Vladimir Putin, plucked from nowhere, it felt like. And very quickly, the election happens, and I remember covering that election very well. And Vladimir Putin was elected, and all of a sudden, we have a man from almost nowhere who is the president of Russia. And it's worth remembering in those days, he was a reformer, actually considered a reformer. He began economic reform, talked about opening up Russia, encouraged investment, and really, I think, gave a lot of people in Russia hope that things could be different. As time went on, the reforms slowed. He became less, he was very taken up in early days with Chechnya. And I remember one session that we had with him in the library of the Kremlin. He invited journalists, Western journalists, to the library of the Kremlin, a beautiful room. And we sat around a big round table. And since I was kind of the senior Western person there, because I'd been in Russia for quite a while, I sat to the right of him around this table. And I remember watching him as he, I guess I'd say, dissected a little pie, a little, like, kind of, they're called pirozhki, that little pierogi, pierogies. Well, this is a little pirozhok and some tea. He was drinking green tea, no vodka. And that changed, by the way. After Putin came in, members of the government stopped drinking vodka at 9 a.m. and began drinking tea. So green tea became suddenly very fashionable. But I watched him, and he was methodical. Quick impression, I think you wouldn't notice him in a crowd. You know, if he were here today, he would just blend in with kind of everybody else. Very good at drawing you out, not projecting his own personality, but he has there's a certain amount of charisma. But he's not a Bill Clinton, let's put it that way. He's not an outgoing, powerful personality. And certainly he's not, very tall, not physically imposing at all. And as he sat there was one thing that he almost physically transformed before our eyes, and that was a mention of Chechnya, which, as you remember, the Russians have fought 2 wars in Chechnya, which is part of Russia, but wanted to be a breakaway area. And Putin launched the second war in Chechnya. And I remember somebody asking him about Chechnya, and he just bored in. I mean, it was like a bullet. He was furious. He was dismissive of any of their cause. He considered them terrorists, and he was out to destroy them. You remember maybe a phrase that he used early on, which is, we're going to wipe them out in the outhouse. And actually, in Russian, it's much cruder. I mean, I can't even say it here, but a very, very off-color expression for wiping somebody out in the outhouse. He wanted to destroy terrorists in Chechnya. He was angry at the United States for not calling them terrorists. We, at that point, the U.S. government was calling them, rebels or fighters, et cetera. But usually, at that point, the U.S. was not calling them terrorists, and it infuriated him. And that continues today. That is really part of the narrative in Syria. Putin does not think that the United States really understands the Syrian opposition. He is very dismissive of them. He considers that a lot of them are terrorists. Maybe there are some kind of more democracy-oriented freedom fighters, he would say, but essentially a lot of them are very dangerous people who, if you give them an inch in Syria, will begin to take over other countries in the region, destabilize, come back to Russia, destabilize Russia, and maybe even end up attacking the United States. That's the way he looks at it, and that has been part of his narrative with the United States. He really, I think, considers the United States naive when it comes to groups in other countries that might be, let's call them, Arab Spring rebels. Putin usually considers, I'm generalizing, but I mean in almost any country that you can think of, Syria, Egypt, certainly Libya, he considers them essentially terrorists who are part of a worldwide network of terrorists that want to destroy Russia, the United States, and that the United States just doesn't see it. So it's an interesting part of it. Now, let's look, getting back to this week and this past couple of weeks, and the mind of Vladimir Putin. You probably remember that article that he wrote for the New York Times, that op-ed piece, and I wanted to go into that just a little bit because, again, it was, I think, a glimpse into his mind. Who wrote it? Well, when I was in Russia this past couple of weeks, I went to a forum. It's called the Valdai Discussion Club. And it sounds like you sit around and, I don't know, have a drink and talk. But actually, it's very well organized. Yearly, it's been happening for 10 years. This was the 10th anniversary discussion of experts and government officials, et cetera. It was the first time I'd ever been there. It was invitation only, quite an interesting thing to see. And Putin, for 10 years, has come to this forum. And this time, he talked for 3 hours. It was televised. He talked a little bit, but basically just fielded questions. And talk about an interesting glimpse into his mind. He talked about Syria, talked about Iran, he talked about their anti-gay, the gay pornography, basically, he would consider it gay propaganda law that they have, a lot of different subjects. So what motivates him right now? Well, let's go back to that New York Times article that he wrote, probably crafted, no doubt, crafted by their PR agency, Ketchum, which is a very big international PR agency. But they've been working for Russia for a long time, making a lot of money. But I think it was that op-ed was quite well crafted, I think. I mean, I'd be interested in your opinion, but quite well crafted. And at the end of it, he said, remember, he picked up on that line from Obama, which was, that's what makes us exceptional. That came from the speech, okay, that Obama delivered shortly before. Putin said, and this is a quote, "It is extremely dangerous to see themselves as exceptional, whatever the motivation." And I think I would kind of throw that back at him and say that Russia and Putin consider themselves exceptional. That if America has what we talk about as American exceptionalism, Russia has that too. And it's, for me, very important to understand this basic trend in Russia right now. It's this soft power strategy that I'm writing my paper, if my professor this weekend accepts the latest version of my paper. I think talks about Russia as an exceptional nation. Putin certainly sees it that way. Now, when we say exceptional, what does it mean? Well, I think Vladimir Putin looks at his country, at Russia, as a country that fits into the West, is part of Europe, but is different. It's what we might jokingly say terminally unique. We have democracy in the United States, they have democracy in Russia. It's called managed democracy. Sandra and I practically, I mean, we could have talked for 5 hours this morning about this because it is a concept that Sandra has written about so eloquently in books and articles galore. But it's democracy, but it's democracy not in the way we quite look at it. The messy type of democracy that America has. I mean, we really do have kind of a messy democracy. And I would say that's one of the strengths. We make mistakes. We try certain things. We have, look at this civil rights movement. It took years and years, for that decades to come together. Messy doesn't do it justice. It was brutal and repressive. But eventually, the United States came to laws to protect people and to protect minorities. Managed democracy, and this is the way that Vladimir Putin looks at it, and believe me, I've talked to people in his government about this. They would say, we believe in democracy, but full democracy, but not quite yet. And not quite yet means that, the people, the Russian people, is all now in quotation marks. But the Russian people, Russians would say, in the government would say, Russian people are pretty crazy. Left to their own devices, they will start a revolution. They will vote for the wrong people. They will make massive mistakes. You can't really let them do what they want to do, because if they do what they want to do, they'll get into trouble, and the country will fall apart. So we get what I would term infantilization of people, which is you can have democracy, but right now, 20 years from now, 10 years, 20 years, but right now, we have to make sure that nothing goes wrong. So what you do is you create structures that make sure that nothing outside of the parameters of your sense of democracy happens. And that's why you have elections that are almost fair. You know, not quite. Like I think they're getting better, but there's always that element, you know, who got on TV, who didn't get onto TV. There are people I know who can't get onto TV in Moscow. They used to be on TV 10 years ago. They were on TV all the time, but they're not. They're blacklisted right now because they talk about, I don't know, critical things. And it's not, I have to, you know, back up and say, this is not the KGB coming to your door necessarily, breaking down the door and hauling you to the gulag. That's not what we're talking about. It is, although in certain cases, like the Pussy Riot woman, the women, one of whom is now on a hunger strike. Just a few days ago, she announced a hunger strike out in Mordovia, in this prison camp. So bad things still happen, but it's much more subtle. It reminds me of kind of like, you play according to our rules and things will be fine for you. If you don't play by our rules, we will make sure things are not fine for you. We'll make sure that, well, remember that little tax deal that you did, that you didn't pay all of your taxes? We will come after you. Or, you know, that store that you just opened? Well, why don't you have that emergency fire exit that nobody knows about, but it's on the books, and if you don't have a fire exit, we'll send the inspectors and they'll shut down your store. Do you know what I'm saying? So it's not like, again, battle axes to the doors. It's more using the levers of power to keep people politically in their little boxes so that they don't carry out, they don't criticize, and they don't upset the apple cart. And I think that is a very important part of the trend. I don't want to go too long, but I do want to get into, we talked about the Russian exceptionalism, and I do want to talk about some of the latest trends. Soft power, since it's up there, I should talk about it very briefly because I think it's something for you to watch. Soft power, very quickly, many of you probably know this, but it's a phrase in diplomacy which was coined a few years ago by a professor, an expert, diplomat, et cetera, Joseph S. Nye, Jr., who invented this phrase, which encapsulates the power that a country has, the power of attraction, rather than the hard power of, let's say, military power or economic levers that, let's say, sanctions against Syria would be hard power. Soft power is, for the United States, it's attracting people to the American way of life, to democracy, to the ability of people to participate in their society, to American culture. I was part of that, God, for so many years, U.S. Information Agency. I was, at the age of, 20 or 21, I went off on exhibits to the old Soviet Union where we would explain American life. And people would come to these exhibits and ask about the United States. And it was very much soft diplomacy, attracting people to a country rather than bludgeoning them into submission. But in the end, it's still power. It may be soft, but the aim is to get others to do what a country wants. And Russia, under the Soviet Union, had a very organized, the term didn't exist, but you could argue soft power diplomacy. It had the communist propaganda system, which was very well organized. And actually, you could say, quite influential in developing countries. Remember Africa in the 1960s. Many developing countries. Syria even is a good example of hard and soft power, where Russia had influence in that part of the world. So after the Soviet Union fell apart, all of these structures fell apart. And now Russia is realizing that it has to get on the bandwagon and begin to project its image abroad, not only as, nuclear weapons and force, but as a country that has a very high level of culture, which it does. Opera, ballet, certainly everybody knows about Russian culture. They are now pouring money more aggressively into organizations and agencies in the government, soft power agencies that will try to attract people to Russia just on the soft power alone, with the idea and the hope that they will begin to be attracted by Russia's ideas. And these are very much Putin's ideas. So in a nutshell, what are the ideas? I would say there's some basic concepts right now that we should be watching with Russia. There's certainly, up until now, Russia has impeded the United States in many different areas, deliberately. It has not come out with positive ideas of its own. I'm generalizing, but I think you could say that it hasn't really come out with ideas of its own to solve problems around the world, but it has used whatever leverage it has remaining, mainly at the United Nations, to stop the United States from doing things. And that's, you could argue, that's effective. I mean, if you have a veto power at the United Nations, you can stop a lot of things. But with Syria, all of a sudden, they are beginning to say, to be part of the solution. And I think that is different. Putin is actually becoming a player in a positive sense, as opposed to just a naysayer and a person who, plays both sides, but essentially stymies the United States on many levels. I think that this is one of the more important things that's going on with Russia right now. Is it a strategy? Is it a long-term strategy that they will begin to, project their idea of how things should happen around the world? Or is it a temporary step, a short-term strategy in Syria? I think that we may be on to something. I think that we are seeing a resurgent Russia, a resurgent Putin, who does want to project his power and influence around the world. When we look at him, sometimes we think, well, how could people be attracted to the things that Putin says? I mean, if you're living in the United States, Putin gets a pretty bad rap. Remember the congressman, or maybe it was a senator, who reacted to Putin's op-ed by saying, "It makes me want to vomit," I think, or throw up, was the phrase. So Putin's not the most popular person. But in other countries, his idea of sovereignty, the right of any country to not be invaded by the United States, no matter how repressive, to do its own thing, even in Syria, to attack its own people. Putin believes very strongly that no matter how unattractive and maybe repressive a government is or a leader is, that they have the right to sovereignty and that they should not be forced to do what they don't want to do. That is diametrically opposed, of course, to what the United States idea is, which is responsibility to protect. Phrase that some of you probably know. It's a concept that's out there, that if there is something, let's say, mass murder of a civilization, of ethnic groups or within a country, that the world community has a responsibility to intervene. That's more what the United States approach would be, although you can see it doesn't always happen. But Putin does not agree, at least at this point, with responsibility to protect. He believes that countries should not be forced to do anything. He is against regime change. And on Syria, he believes that remember Libya, when the United States took part in a bombing campaign and protecting Benghazi? He believes that the United States turned that bombing campaign to protect lives into regime change, and he's not going to go there again. That was under President Medvedev. If you remember the previous president, who, Mr. Putin has pulled a couple of switcheroos. It's almost hard to remember, but he started out as president, then he became, after 2 terms in office, he couldn't run again. He became the prime minister. He was the prime minister for 1 term. Then they changed the Constitution and allowed a 6-year term. So he came back to run again. He's now in his first term, part 2. And if this time he could be, if he doesn't step down, he will be in power until 2018. And if he ran again, he could be in power for almost a quarter of a century, which is really longer than any Russian or Soviet leader since Joseph Stalin. So be prepared, we'll see. But in any case, that I think is part of his motivation. And I'll end on one thing that I also think is part of his motivation, and I don't think it's a good trend. I find it worrisome, but it's happening, and I picked up on it very strongly this time in Moscow. Remember, it's no secret that there has been anti-Americanism in Russia. And during the 2012 election campaign, anti-Americanism was very, very much, you could notice it almost everywhere. U.S. officials were told that, this is from a senior official, that don't worry, we have to do this for some domestic reasons, look tough, but after the election is over, that was 2012, after the election is over, we'll kind of stop that. But you guys understand, you do this, during an election campaign, your presidents and candidates do the same thing. They get tough on Russia, and it's true. But unfortunately, the anti-American sentiment didn't die out, and it's still there, but it has grown, and I would argue, within the last few months, it has grown into this movement that is beginning to gel, which is looking at the West in general as corrupt, as the source of corruption in the world, morally bankrupt. Now, I mentioned that anti-gay propaganda law that was passed very recently, kind of a strange law, which was supposed to protect children from propaganda by homosexuals. It has turned into something that is very unclear how it will be carried out. But I see that law, which many people, even in Russia, have some problems with, but I see that law as part of a bigger trend to depict the world outside of Russia, as, again, morally bankrupt, and Russia as a center of morality, bearer of, let's say, civilization, and it works with Putin's, burgeoning power, world leader, and leading a nation that is united. This does not play, this type of anti-Western thing doesn't play in big cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg, which are very much like, New York, Chicago, on many levels. Educated people making money, in fact, a lot of money, billions of dollars. You'd be surprised if you went to Moscow how much money is sloshing around that city. But it doesn't really kind of penetrate in the bigger cities. But when you get out into the hinterland, this idea that of the West as being corrupt does work. And it keeps people on your side, the less educated, the less affluent, people in small towns with no hope, and who've never been exposed to foreigners, who do think of the end of the Soviet Union as a very bad thing. Their lives did get worse. So they're very open to this idea. And what I think I would kind of end on this, that Russian society, as I started to say at the very beginning, is very complex. And so as you try to look at it, yeah, I think it's very important to keep the grays, not just the black and white, but the grays. You can meet people in Moscow who would fit in perfectly right here. They might have kids in the United States going to school. They would buy the same products that we buy. They're on the internet. They're exposed to all sorts of things that we're exposed to. Then you have other people who are not as well off. And when Putin unleashes some of this PR, let's call it, propaganda campaign, you can play with fire. You know, you can play with nationalism. You can play with very retrograde elements on the anti-homosexual law. It has actually unleashed some people who are now, unfortunately, on the internet. They go out, they beat up and torture gay people and put it on the internet, you know, the actual physical assault. So, you know, when you, in a society that's changing very quickly, when you begin to unleash forces against anyone, you know, the Nazis did it against the Jews. In the United States, people did it against African Americans. But when you unleash these forces, it's very dangerous. And when you don't have a civil society, what you are, I mean, this is a perfect example of civil society. People who want to learn things, be exposed to ideas, who come together. Nobody forced you to come. You weren't paid, you know, $25 to show up by your party, your political party. You're here because you're a member of civil society. You probably vote, I'm sure. You all vote. You probably, you know, contribute at your church. You probably are, you know, members of civic organizations. Russia doesn't have a lot of that. It doesn't have the tradition. During communist days, all of that was destroyed. Not that they had a lot to begin with, but the Communist Party was put in its place. And when the Communist Party fell apart in 1991, there was nothing to replace it. It's almost like the skeleton of the society dissolved, leaving this kind of body that disintegrated. And the structures that people had at their offices, their work, their factories, fell apart too. So in this chaos, which is only 20 years ago, I think we forget, but 20 years ago, what replaces it, you know? When people don't have a lot, they can be swayed by many different things. So my hope for Russia, and I think it may take another generation of leadership to really get to this point, but my hope for Russia is that they will be not terminally unique the way they are now, or they think they are now, but they will be just another country, one of the great countries of the world, one of the great civilizations of the world, but another country that is not a big mystery, that functions like other countries and can be part of the world, you know, not off by itself, not thinking that it is, you know, like inferior and superior at the same time, which is not, you know, psychologically so hard to understand, but it's a little dysfunctional. I hope that they will feel that they're part of the world, and that society, civil society, will grow and strengthen, and that the relations with Russia will not be constantly a reference to the Cold War. We don't have a bumper sticker. Maybe that's a good job for some of the students here. to think of a bumper sticker for relations between Russia and the United States. There isn't a bumper sticker. There's nothing that, like communism versus capitalism. It's so great. Hammer and sickle. They're very, emotive Hollywood images. What's the image right now? I don't know. But I wish it weren't hammer and sickle Cold War. We need to get something that reflects the reality of modern Russia. We're right in the midst of it, so I hope that eventually we can come up with something. And I think I will end on that. I appreciate the opportunity to almost think aloud as I talked, because it spurred, as I was looking at your faces and thinking, almost like friends, that I wanted to come back and say, hey, you won't believe what happened in Russia. That ideas would come to my mind that maybe I didn't have before. So I found it a stimulating experience, and now I really want to get some questions. So thank you very much. So Sandra, are you the MC, or how do we do it?
You're the MC.
Oh, okay, all right. Well, let's see.
I think, yes. Do we see questions?
Yeah, I have a question. A few years ago,
Could you speak loud?
Sure.
a few years ago, someone sent me a video clip of youth camps in Russia, Putin's youth.
Oh,
Have you
yes.
seen any of that in the last couple of years?
That is a good question. The question was about youth camps. In the Soviet Union, there were youth camps. In fact, I stayed in one a long time ago. There's an organization, you may be referring to a youth organization that's called Nashi, N-A-S-H-I. Well, Nashi was founded, I would say about maybe 8 years ago, probably no longer than that. And it was founded by a person who was in the Kremlin administration. They realized that they no longer had the youth groups of the Soviet Union. And so they created this group. And Nashi means ours, Nashi, ours. And what they wanted to do was galvanize youth to support the Kremlin. They attracted youth, young people from all over Russia, but not really the big cities, mainly from smaller cities, where the kids realized that if they came to the big city, went through these camps, and they were not really like summer camps necessarily, although they did, and they probably still do, have a physical camp outside of Moscow. But they would come and get preparation for participating in politics, almost like young Democrats, young Republicans, but with a certain Kremlin edge. And very quickly at that point, they began hounding Western countries. In fact, I remember there was a period where the Kremlin kind of sicked them on the Estonian ambassador. I'm trying to remember the exact reason, but Estonia and Russia have always had kind of difficult relations. And so these young people would go over to the embassy, the Estonian embassy, and have demonstrations against them. And it's, again, I could use the word Hitler Youth, and I don't think that it's too far off. They have been pretty quiescent. I think they may be kind of falling apart. Times are changing very rapidly, but that may be the group that you're referring to. Again, playing with fire. Because, it's fine if you have young Republicans and young Democrats, but when you turn into Hitler Youth, it's a little dangerous.
Yes, there.
Hi there.
What kind of working relationship does the Russian foreign minister have with Putin? And in the negotiations that he's been conducting with Kerry, I was wondering how free a hand he has on his own, or to what extent he has to consult with Putin.
That's a very good question about the relationship between the foreign minister and the Kremlin, and how much leeway he has to let's say, set his own policy or to work out the policy. The foreign minister is Sergei Lavrov. He's a very experienced, very slick, diplomat, very smart, knows the United Nations like the back of his hand, and knows exactly what he's doing. Now, he does, of course, represent Kremlin policy. He does not make policy, but he does have quite a role, I think, in advising and formulating that policy. He does not do things on his own, though. I mean, this is really, there has to be a Kremlin decision to do what they're doing on Syria. This didn't just originate with Lavrov. And as you know, Putin and Obama had discussed some of the, general outlines of trying to control Syria's chemical weapons quite a while ago, when they met at the G8 at least. So, but Lavrov is a fascinating person to watch. And I think you have to, he's very good at kind of advancing things and then pulling them back. The fear right now about Syria is that every day you're going to see different stories. And when we get to Monday, when the UN inspectors are supposed to go into Syria and begin setting up a structure, a working structure for actually cataloging, going to the sites where these chemical weapons are, cataloging, does it match the report that the central government, Syrian government gave to the UN? Do they really have the weapons that they said they have? And then beginning to figure out what they're going to do with them. Every day is going to be different. And this could all backfire. It's carrying this out, destroying chemical weapons in the middle of a civil war, as you all know, is going to be extremely complex. And who's going to protect them? Because as one person was saying, just a friend of mine who's in this business of arms inspection and chemical weapons said, no matter who goes in there, there's going to be a vested interest that both sides have to take a pot shot at them, or not such a pot shot, to really attack these inspectors and blame it on the other guy. So that's going to be kind of a dangerous time. Yes? Mike?
You mentioned soft power, and I'm thinking about the fact that you also mentioned Putin's reaction to 9/11. I've often said that if the United States had not gone into, well, a lot of people have said, I've often thought if we hadn't gone into Iraq, what a different world it would be. Now, President Obama is facing a similar circumstance, isn't he, with respect to Syria? We're seeing soft power being shown on the part of Russia. And what do you think the implications are if Obama acts in Syria or if he doesn't act in Syria? And when I use the word act, I mean militarily.
Well, I think that's a dilemma for President Obama right now. He was poised to do it. Did he want to do it? I'm not convinced that he wanted to do that. Nobody really wants to get involved in Syria very much. That's the sad truth. It's talk about complex. That country, as we all know, is key. It's a big country. When I was in Libya, right at the end of that war, that's peanuts compared to what Syria is. And you have mixed groups. You have the influence of Syria in the region. You have Israel. You have Iran. It's very complex. I don't think that Obama wanted to take action. But when he set up that red line, you can't just say, oh, sorry, didn't mean it. Red line, oops, well, yeah, kind of. He had to do something. So he had set himself up, I think, to take action. But he was not looking forward to that. And any type of military action that you took, even if it was just, launching missiles from ships in the Mediterranean, you still are involved. Maybe boots not on the ground, right, but you are involved. So Putin, in a way, gave him an out. But ultimately, if this all falls apart, Putin gets to blame a lot of people. I mean, Putin can say, well, we tried, we took you up on it, but there's still a narrative. I mean, just over the past few days, certainly in the Russian media, the United States is just champing at the bit to use military power. That's what you hear in Moscow all the time. Obama wants to attack. We held his hand back from attacking, but what he really wants to do is attack. Well, I don't think that is the truth at all. But it's a dilemma. I don't know. I honestly don't know what will happen. If they can get the chemical weapons in one place, that's a step in the right direction. But does it ultimately bring us to the point that they can have negotiations and that Assad leaves the picture? That's the question. Is Assad in there, or is he going to step down?
Yeah. There, and then Joan.
Hi.
Okay, I would like to ask you a little bit aside of the political life of Russia. I would like to ask you about the future of Russia in the science and education, because the soft strategy of Putin's government is almost to destroy Russian academy and industrial science and Russian education with these religious items, with this without Russian wonderful classical literature. What do you think about the future of the future generation?
Well, that's a great question, the education in the future. You know, I'll give you a little story. When President Medvedev, a couple of years ago, 2010, came to the United States, and we were able, CNN and I was able to follow him around. And we went to Silicon Valley. And Silicon Valley has thousands of Russians right now. I was amazed. They're really smart. They're very well educated. You know, Russians are excellent at computers. And there was a group that I talked to. They're business people, Russian, they're young, you know, they're all like in their 30s at the most. And they're living in Silicon Valley. They go back and forth, you know, Moscow, the United States, and they would love to go back to their families in Russia and start companies. And this one woman that I talked to, she's really interesting. And I said, so why don't you go back? Just, you know, she said, you know, the problem is that they've started this thing, and it's called Skolkovo. Skolkovo is it's their version of Silicon Valley. Government funded, they started it, they have American companies that are investing. And she said, you know the problem with Skolkovo? Why? She said, it's never going to be Silicon Valley. And I said, why not? Because got mucho bucks coming from the government. You have very smart people, young people who are educated. And she said, because they don't understand failure. And I knew exactly what she was talking about. She said that Skolkovo, in Silicon Valley, you have these companies that people started in their garages, and they failed. And then they learned from that failure, and then they went on, and they started another company, and eventually here we are with, you know, Google and, you know, Amazon and everything else in between. And in Russia, they don't quite get failure. This is, again, you know, getting back to the government, which sees things, you know, don't let those crazy Russian people, you know, make sure that everything is organized so that they will succeed. And so they never learn to fail. They never learn from their mistakes. So I wish them well on Skolkovo. I think it's very intriguing, but until they can really get that entrepreneurship and the ability and the guts to fail, I don't think they're going to be successful.
Joan, that'll be the last question.
Jill, I just had a question about the UN. We're hearing a lot about the UN's participation in all of this Syrian thing. What is Putin's attitude? Has it changed toward the UN? Does he see a difference in the way he or his representatives are going to be acting in the UN at this point?
Well, Putin and the UN. Putin loves the UN because they have a veto. Exactly. I mean, that is their ace in the hole. Because on so many levels, you know, NATO, they're not really a part of NATO, but there's this, you know, NATO-Russia group. The UN is one place that they have a veto. They can stop things in their tracks if they want to. So they love the UN, and that is why, if you look at how the Syria deal is going to come down, if I understand it correctly from what I have just read, let's say that that Assad does not comply, you know, ultimately pulls some shenanigans with chemical weapons. They would go to the Security Council, and the Security Council would vote on what's called Chapter 7, excuse me, Chapter 7 enforcement. Chapter 7 includes a variety of things. It can be economic sanctions, or it can be military force. The Russians don't want military force, so they're willing to say, come back to the United Nations. That's, you know, a step in the right direction. But ultimately, they will have veto power over what step is taken. So once again, we're back to the UN, and that is their ace in the hole.
No, I'm afraid we have to close now.
Oh, okay.
I know that it was a sacrifice for Jill to come here. I remember you blanked out these days. You probably would have been speaking to who knows who in Washington after this past week there, but she saved this time for us. And I think I would like her to save more time for us, and I hope that she'll come back because the Russian story isn't over yet. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.